both good answers. Where we're going is we're going to deny, we got to freeze and deny use of port, right? Port State Measures Agreement requires that if we have a vessel in our port that is IUU, right, or suspected of IUU, you've now got evidence that it's an IUU vessel, you must deny port services. So you're going to go down the path of photographs and collecting your evidence, but you need to, under the agreement, deny port services. So, vessels in port, there wasn't evidence, it started refueling, everything was fine, and suddenly now you're inspecting and find this evidence. You've got to deny port services. So, in the United States, oh, sorry, maybe I'm behind or ahead? Yeah. Gotcha, okay. So, in the United States, I think Katheryn touched on, it's an interagency discussion in Capitol, in Washington, that makes the determination to officially deny port services or to deny port access. That said, Washington, and maybe your capitals are much quicker, Washington can work relatively slowly. And inevitably, these situations arise in either a place like American Samoa or Alaska, and it's on a Friday night, and everybody in Washington has gone home, and we have to try to track everybody back down. So you can't let this just keep going on while you're waiting for us, Washington, to make a final decision. So what we direct is our inspectors, we call it, you're freezing the situation. Okay, you're stopping the refueling. You're basically freezing the whole situation. You're not going to allow anything additional to happen. You're saying, you know, we found some evidence here, and we need to work through this. So at this stage, I'm going to just stop the activity that's going on. Make your referral up your chain of command for us, but you're freezing the situation. Because again, the agreement says you'll stop port services. The official denial of port services occurs when Washington says, yes, we're officially denying port services, and they notify the flag state. Okay? But you as the inspector, again, depending on how your country does it, would at least want to freeze the situation. Okay? So even if you aren't given the authority that you're the one that makes the final decision, you want to freeze the situation, stop the port services from happening. That way, you're in compliance with your obligations under the agreement, while final decisions are made and the diplomatic pieces are put in place. I don't know if that's similar in other countries. So that's part of the advantage of our 96 hours, because we should detect that it's a known IUU vessel or suspected IUU vessel prior, within that 96 hours. That decision could be made in Washington before an approval or denial is given. It's the scenario where the inspector detects, which makes it a little more challenging.
So that point, I just want to clarify, there's two instances where you would deny port services. One, a known IUU vessel is coming to your port. You authorize it to do what? Inspect it, and you have to deny port services. Sorry, there's more than one. Another situation we gave, an IUU vessel comes in the middle of the night, undetected. The inspector goes down in the morning, sees it, sees they have an IUU vessel. You deny port services immediately, make them stop what they're doing. In this case, you find the evidence during the inspection. So there are multiple points where you deny port services. Here is, we just found the bluefin tuna illegally harvested on board.
And very cleverly disguised it was.
So in case of the agreement for when you're conducting an inspection, it highlights examples of significant violations of where you would deny port services. So in this slide, it's you're going to deny if.
Oh, thanks. I thought you were governor. See, we're losing that. So these are the scenarios that are considered IUU. Because we've talked about a lot of different scenarios that would be violations of conservation measures. They don't all rise to the level of a declaration of IUU fishing. You know, we talked about the numbering wasn't the right size. That, while a violation of a conservation measure, not something that rises to IUU or we're going to be denying port services and things like that. So these are outlined in the agreement. So one of the scenarios would be you board the vessel and you detect that the vessel does not have a valid authorization for where it was fishing, okay, by either the flag state or the coastal state, depending upon where it was fishing. You'd also deny use of port if there's clear evidence the fish on board was taken in contravention of applicable requirement. So kind of the scenario I was giving, the vessel didn't have authorization to fish where it was fishing, the fish on board was from that area. Now you've detected that that fish was harvested in violation of the conservation and management measures. That's a significant violation. That would cause us to deny port services. The other thing that the agreement does do is it gives you the option to request of the flag state verification that the fish was harvested legally. Okay? If the flag state does not confirm within a reasonable time the fish on board was taken within applicable requirements, you could deny port services as well. What is a reasonable time is not defined in the agreement, and you probably don't want to get in a mode where you're completely always relying on the flag state each and every time to verify the legality. Under the agreement, there's many tools that we can do that. You can, however, request of the flag state, and if they don't respond, you can use that as a basis to deny port services. Is there any questions? Good so far? Okay. Yeah, it must have been me. I had to read it one. And this gets into the fishing related. So the scenario we gave previously, a vessel, a carrier vessel took on product from an IUU vessel, a known IUU vessel. That would be an example here. You want to hit this one?
So this is an example, well, this is just the example that Todd was giving in terms of our flow, our standard operating procedure, and a recap of what we've talked about. We authorize the vessel entry. We did an inspection, we're doing an inspection. We did an inspection, okay? We didn't find any, if we don't find any evidence of IUU fishing, of course, they can offload the catch, they can get fuel, they can get their switch out crew, go about their business. If we found reasonable grounds to suspect IUU fishing, this is where in our workflow, Brandon in Honolulu or American Samoa, he freezes the scene, and for us, the headquarters office is who makes this decision. So this is just how we often do our standard operating procedures and what we call workflows to simplify it so that our officers in the field know if no, if yes, do this. So it's just a way, kind of similar to the exercise we did earlier, break it down.
What is it?
Sorry?
This.
Oh, the scrapping that you love.
We put that in because it is in the agreement.
Todd hates this.
There is an exemption that you could allow an IUU vessel in strictly for the purposes of it being scrapped. Which makes sense, but it's a legal document and a binding treaty, so you need that caveat in there so that you end up with a vessel you're trying to scrap. And we have FAO is going
FAO would like to weigh in on that.
FAO would like to weigh in.
Not really. Actually, what happened was NOAA had the first DSM measures way before the SMA was agreed. And at a certain point, the rule said that once the vessel was qualified IUU, could not leave the port. Those were NOAA rules. And what happened was that some of the national authorities realized that the vessels were going to be scrapped, but they needed to leave the port to be scrapped. So they had to review the rules in NOAA saying that not only the vessel can leave the port to be scrapped, but can enter another port to be scrapped. And I think that countries like Norway and others then made sure that that was in the DSMA. So those things that happen once every 10 years are still considered legal.
Yeah, this was not a contentious issue during the negotiations. It made perfectly good sense that we want to allow IUU vessels to be scrapped, so whatever was necessary to do so.
So we're similarly to what we provided in previous presentations, these are just questions that we've developed to help guide your processes, to help you with your standard operating procedures, help you develop your own communication plans in terms of who has the authority. A lot of time it's the port authorities, okay? Sometimes you as a fisheries inspector may not be the one that can deny port services. So you need to have those strong relationships with the people that work in your port. Sometimes it's the port authority, you have to call them and then they have that legal authority. In some countries, it's actually the national police that have to come. So knowing who do you need to contact, who has the authority to do this, who's making the decision. In Indonesia, is that your PSM secretariat? In the Philippines, is that your one-stop action center? I just know their system's the best, so apologize for always going back to those countries, but we work with them closely, okay? So these are just questions to help guide thought processes and develop standard operating procedures. India, did you have a question?
Going back to the scrapping.
Oh,
Suppose if we have given access to a vessel
okay.
Which is listed in the IUU from a flag state which is not a party to PSMA.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay. So whether you allow the IUU listed fishing vessel to leave the port without, okay, you are not offering any services. They come in and will you allow them to leave the port again?
If you did not find a violation of India's law and have no reason or no reasonable grounds to seize and detain that vessel and carry out law enforcement actions, then yes, you would have to let them leave. But you don't have to give them port services.
Actually, you can't if you're a party to the
Right.
agreement. So.
Well, if you're, yeah. You would not give them fuel.
Right.
Singapore.
Yeah, I think the scrapping thing is picking up ground. I'll ask a similar question. So, would it be accurate for me to just, for example, this scenario? So a vessel comes in, right? Found that it's IUU, right? I guess one thing you would do is prosecute it, but then after that, if it's found to be guilty, then I guess you allow it to leave to be scrapped for if that port or for example like us, right? We don't have any scrapping facilities.
Right.
So does that mean that I would have to make arrangements? But that's one scenario. The other scenario is if I don't prosecute it, I decide to say, hey, the denial of port entry, no port services, get out, you're guilty, you're IUU vessel. So I basically allow it to leave, but what assurance do I have that it's going to be scrapped?
Okay, so one, I fear that the scrapping thing is getting a little beyond. So let me go back to just the agreement so we're all clear on the agreement. A known IUU vessel enters your port for the purpose of inspection, right? Because you can't let a known IUU vessel in unless you're going to inspect it. Okay, and you're going to deny port services. You find no evidence of national law where Singapore or India could take action, then your obligation under the agreement is to deny it port services, deny it use of your port, and send it on its way. Your inspection report then goes to the flag state and relevant coastal or international organizations such as the RFMO, and the vessel moves on its way. It's not fantastic, but it's the only thing you can do. Okay, that's one scenario. Two, the vessel comes to your port, you find evidence of IUU fishing, you then deny port services. You find a violation of Singapore law that allows you to seize the vessel and confiscate it. Fantastic, we've solved the IUU problem. You've taken action under Singapore law. Now, as far as sending it on its way, because it's an IUU vessel, to be scrapped, the agreement allows for the purposes that it may leave for the purposes of being scrapped. That would be under you, because you've now seized it, it's in your custody. You can then send it somewhere else to be scrapped, and the other party can allow entry into their port of a known IUU vessel strictly for the purposes of it being scrapped. Does that clarify it? And again, I don't want to focus too much on the scrapping. It literally only happens, in very rare instances.
And just to be clear, you're not letting the vessel master take it
Right.
to go get scrapped.
Right.
You're not sending it with its vessel master and crew.
Yes. So I would advocate that if the vessel says, hold on, let me go, I'm going to go ahead and get my vessel scrapped, I would deny that. I would deny that. Does that help? Because I know it can be, some of these nuances, I think we can get too far down the road on scrapping, is all. Let's focus on what actions we need to take as flag states, or as parties to the agreement, or hopefully soon to be parties to the agreement. Do you guys want to add anything? We're good.
If you would like to talk further about this scrapping outside of this discussion,
We have started.
I am more than happy to tell you about the approach that Australia takes and has taken in relation to dealing with those kind of things. But we'll leave it for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions not related to scrapping? Good question. That's just on that slide because it's in the agreement. So that's generally for us, that's our tuna fleet that works in the Pacific. For the most part, we don't have other distant water fleets. We also have an obligation to the port state. It's obviously focused on the port state, but the flag state is required to hold its vessels accountable. So we've talked a lot about they're in your port, you find a violation of a conservation and management measure, but you don't have any authority under your own national statute to hold that foreign vessel accountable. You report that to the flag state, they have an obligation under the agreement to investigate and take appropriate action. Okay? So it doesn't tell them what that appropriate action is, but it means that if you supply information to them, they are obligated under the agreement to investigate and take effective and appropriate action. Okay? So that is kind of a nice addition. In a lot of ways, the flag state always should be responsible, but it basically forces that issue that there's now an obligation that they need to investigate and to take appropriate action. Actually, I already hit the take appropriate action, so there we go.
What happens if they don't? What could happen? IUU listing. IUU listing.
Oh, so yeah, so the other thing under the RFMOs, remember each RFMO has its own process for identifying IUU vessels. Typically, a vessel may commit a serious infringement in one of the RFMOs, but if the flag state takes appropriate action, then that vessel is not going to end up on an IUU vessel list. Okay? They may have committed IUU, but effective and appropriate action was taken by the flag state. A fine, withdrawal of their permit, some other significant action. As long as the members of the RFMO agree that that was appropriate action, then generally that will not become an IUU vessel. However, if, for example, you report significant or serious infraction to the flag state and they don't take any action, there is always a ramification that the RFMO members could still pursue IUU vessel listing for that vessel because the flag state didn't take appropriate action. Do you guys want to add to that?
I've just got a quick example of when that did occur in the CCSBT, so the Commission for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna. We had a WCPFC authorised vessel that was fishing on the high seas off the east coast of Australia. But what they were actually targeting was southern bluefin tuna. so which is not a permitted species under the WCPFC. So, because that falls under a different RFMO under the CCSBT. That vessel, we boarded that vessel and took DNA samples of the catch and found southern bluefin tuna on board. We, as the process says, contacted the flag state and provided the evidence that we collected. China, being the flag state, actually reported back to us and noted that they had taken action against that vessel, which included taking their licence away, as well as blacklisting the owner of the vessel. So we, as Australia, had to make a decision on whether we considered the action to be appropriate to what the actual infringement or the violation was. We made the decision that we believed that that was an appropriate measure, and therefore didn't look to blacklist, look to put that vessel on an IU list. So that's, I guess, how it practically works.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. Rob?
Yeah, very briefly, that is exactly the same process, at least in the North Atlantic, RFMOs. As you rightly mentioned before, normally there is a period between the sorry, yeah, up to the annual meeting. Between the identification of the IUU vessel to the annual meeting. And normally the secretariats of the organizations use that period to contact the flag state and try to understand what was going on. And some vessels were listed in the very beginning. Normally, if the flag state had no interest in replying within 3 weeks, that would be normally the reason enough to list the vessel as IUU.
So one other piece here is to share information back to whoever's making the report to you. So if you were to send me a report of an infraction on a U.S. flagged vessel, I not only have an obligation to investigate and take appropriate action, I have an obligation to let you know what action was taken. And that would not necessarily be just to you, that could also be to the relevant RFMO. As Brendan mentioned, that process, how that scenario worked, exactly the same thing. They provided feedback, they provided the evidence, the flag state provided information back on their action, and they evaluated it was sufficient. But it's that communication, cooperation, sharing of information that's required under the agreement that we all need to be concerned about and paying attention to, but it's also a really big positive for all of us in this room for the agreement. It basically facilitates that discussion and makes sure that we are engaging and cooperating. The only other thing is the Port State Measures Agreement, as we said, it applies to foreign flagged fishing and fishing support vessels, right? But the agreement also has a provision under the flag state section that says that flag states should also apply similar measures to their own flagged vessels. So you can't have one standard way up here for foreign flagged vessels and have no standards for your own domestic vessels. The agreement says there needs to be some comparability to how you treat foreign vessels as well as your domestic fleet, acknowledging that the agreement applies to foreign flagged vessels entering your ports. It's basically saying you need to apply similar standards to your own vessels for permitting items.
That's the next point. Okay. Developing those standard operating procedures, particularly with joint boarding teams, if they don't already exist. Okay? Who's collecting that AREP? Who's screening that AREP? Who's sending that information to the inspector? Having these pieces laid out clearly. This can be done in a varying ways. Standard operating procedures, communication plans. If I need to deny port services and I don't have the authority to do that, who do I call? If I find an issue with a crew member, who do I call? Do you know who to call in your immigration departments? If there is a food safety or concern, do you know how to contact your quarantine, your customs, your national police if somebody needs to be arrested? Do you know who to call in these situations? Reference materials. We advocate for this for a lot, and we have our partners to thank, because this has been a major outcome of a lot of our trainings, both with our own inspectors and officers as well as with our international partners. The need to make sure that your inspectors have the proper resources, boarding checklists, RFMO guides, fish ID guides, so what Brandon was saying. Oftentimes your science side of the house, the fishery side, they often have those fish ID guides working within your agency. We talked a lot about the different options for assisting with translation, okay, and boarding. Nowadays, Google Translate's pretty good.